My guest today is Professor Esteban Rossi-Hansberg, who is Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, fellow of the Econometric Society, and the editor of the Journal of Political Economy. Welcome, Esteban.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, so I have a couple of your working papers. I found them extremely interesting. And I want to start with the economic geography of global warming, in which you say global warming is a worldwide and protracted phenomenon with heterogeneous local economic effects. In order to evaluate the aggregate and local economic consequences of higher temperatures, we propose a dynamic economic assessment model of the world economy with high spatial resolution. Our model features a number of mechanisms through which individuals can adapt to global warming, including costly trade and migration, and local technological innovation, and natality rates. Natality rates, I suspect, is birth minus death rates. So we quantify the model at a 1 degree resolution and estimate damage functions that determine the impact of temperature changes on a region's fundamental productivity and abilities depending on local temperatures. Yeah, so this is really interesting. You know, it's not something that I ever thought about. The temperature rise and the associated effects are always thought about sort of global phenomenon. We don't really, we share the environment, we share the atmosphere. So wherever the problem exists, everybody is going to pay for it ultimately. But in this paper, you're looking at sort of more locally, right? There is a local cost to this issue. So how do you determine the local cost?
Right. So the main idea that we want to push forward, and we think it's an important way to think about this problem of climate change and global warming specifically, is that perhaps the best way to think about it is by thinking about this issue. So if you think about the global temperatures and kind of the distribution of temperatures in different parts of the world, what you see is that the range of temperatures is quite large. So at growing season, say agricultural growing season, maybe 30 degrees Celsius range around there. While, even the most extreme scenarios for climate change, you're thinking about maybe, 6 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. So when you think about it that way, it's obvious that, there's some places that are very cold now that, if you add the 6 degrees to those places, it's not like a terrible outcome, and it may be actually good for them. Well, obviously for some other places that are already pretty warm, 6 degrees Celsius of additional temperature is terrible, right? And it can be catastrophic for their economies, and it can be very hard to live, or could turn out to be very hard to live in those places. And so what this implies is that, the implications of global temperature increases are going to be very different in different parts of the world, simply because the baseline temperature that they have is so different. And so we want to take this to heart and think about that heterogeneity. And thinking about that heterogeneity then leads to, a very different way of thinking about climate change more broadly. And the key is that, well, once you recognize that there may be winners and losers, even if there's many more losers, even if we think that at the end of the day, lots of places are going to lose as a result of this phenomenon, and many will for sure. You face the following issue, that if we can then take economic activity and move it to places that are going to be better off as a result of this, right, then the cost of this phenomenon is going to be smaller, right? If this process of moving economic activity is simple and cheap, right, then the costs are going to be limited. If, on the other hand, it's super hard to move economic activity, and we have to produce wherever we are today, and in particular in the places that are going to get are going to be hurt the most as a result of increases in temperature, then of course the costs are going to be very large. And so this kind of heterogeneous impact across locations is very important because, of course, moving economic activity is a potential adaptation mechanism to this phenomenon. And so what we want to do is and so, this can go from completely easy adaptation to, very hard adaptation that is going to involve very high costs. And so the question is, well, where are we? What are the real costs of this? And for that, you need to model this, and you need to quantify essentially the cost of this type of adaptation mechanisms, namely moving the ability of people to move to other locations. How costly is it to do that? The ability to change specialization, namely change what you produce in a given place. Perhaps, temperature is very bad for agriculture, but it's not as bad for other forms of production. And so if you can switch easily to other forms of production, that's also going to make it cheaper. And of course, if you can, develop parts of the world that have not been developed so far, and you can go there and invest and create the new cities over there, then that process is also going to be cheaper. And so the idea is to try to think about these costs and think about how, where people would move and what are the possibilities of developing those places in the future, and try to evaluate the cost of climate change that results once you take into account all this possibility of adjusting for this type of phenomenon. So it's not only that we care about how, individual locations are going to do as a result of this. And of course we do, because the world cares and individuals care about how their own homes and their locations where they live are going to fare as a result of this phenomenon, but also because if you think about what are the economic costs in the aggregate for the world, you need to take into account these adaptation mechanisms across space. And so that's exactly what we want to bring in.
Yeah, so there are differential impacts. That is the point, right? So, I grew up in southern India, the southern tip of the Indian peninsula. When I was growing up there, it was hot and humid. It's gotten much worse now.
Right.
And I came to Chicago, and I live in Connecticut now. And I can imagine, walking around in Hyde Park at the height of winter, I could definitely use some global warming. And that is not true for other parts of the world by the equator. And so there are differential impacts to start with. And then the question is, it's a little bit of an optimization problem, right? In the sense that, can people move from negatively affected areas to other areas? So migration is one aspect. And then I think in this paper, you talk also about, can they locally adapt? So maybe there are industries, maybe there are other things that are more suitable for hot climates and for cold climates. So there could be sort of concentration of certain types of industries. So in effect, we can actually project forward and say what might happen, right, in terms of temperatures, and then take that into account in some sort of a global decision-making process. But obviously, the problem is in the details. It's often difficult to move people.
Definitely. So what you want to do, and what we've tried to do, is essentially create a global model of individual decisions of, where to live, what to consume, who to trade with, and firm decisions of where is it best to produce, what type of investments you want to do in terms of developing your technologies, etc. So think about individual decision making, and then aggregate that in what economists call a general equilibrium model that takes into account all these different interactions and kind of the markets that aggregate them, and then think about what type of decisions this generates. Where are people going to be? How much are they going to produce, etc. And given that, you can calculate the type of emissions that this will generate. So like the carbon emissions that this will generate, and then in turn, those emissions, then we can go to the scientific literature, borrow the carbon cycle models that they've generated, which essentially tell you, well, given those emissions, how those global temperatures are going to evolve as a result of those emissions, and then bring that back by saying, well, these global temperatures then are going to have an impact on local temperature, which in turn is going to affect the local economies. Namely, it's going to affect how productive firms are in given locations, how productive agriculture is, for example, or how productive different industries are, and also how attractive a particular area is as a place to live. So, if it's very warm, obviously, like you were saying, if it's very warm and humid, it may be not as attractive to live in a particular location. And so obviously agents are going to take all of those characteristics of a location in order to make their decisions of where they want to live in a place or not. Now, of course, as you were saying, the devil is in the details, in the sense of, how costly is it for these people, for example, to actually move, right, across locations. So you may think, well, we're all attached to the place where we're born or to particular places in the world, etc. So it's hard to move people around. But, people do move. And we have some evidence about how they move and what type of differences in wages and kind of what type of attractions are important in motivating those moves. And so we can use that data to try to make the model account for the type of movements of population that we see in the world, and bring that in as data that informs the model, and therefore gives us a good sense of how costly is it to move, and therefore how costly is this type of adaptation to this phenomenon going to be. And once you have this, then you can project it forward and say, well, over time, where are people going to be? What is the type of movement that climate change is going to generate? And have predictions of how costly this phenomenon is by comparing, what these type of models predict for the future relative to a world in which this was not happening, for example, in which climate change was not happening. So once you model it, what the reason a model is useful here, rather than say pure empirical extrapolation of particular trends or things like that, the reason a model of individual behavior is useful is because exactly you can calculate this type of contrafactual exercise, or what we call a contrafactual exercise, which are, well, if the circumstances were different, how would individuals react to those different circumstances, and then kind of do the same type of aggregation that we do to explain current outcomes. And you can do that and then compare these things and evaluate the cost of this phenomenon overall.
Yeah, so the crux of the problem here appears to be, if the world were one country, the implementation would be very easy. But we have 200 different countries with 200 different local objective functions with varying objectives there. And so when we bring these countries together, and we had this Paris Agreement that you talk about here, which is sort of a mishmash of ideas and localization of costs and benefits that ultimately doesn't really help, right? I mean, what do you get out of the Paris Agreement?
Well, this is a global phenomenon that is a global externality, right? So even though these effects are local, it comes as what individual countries do in terms of the emissions that they generate in their production process, mix in the atmosphere very quickly, and that affects global temperatures, which in turn, like I said before, are going to affect local temperatures. But the point is that what you do, the emissions that a particular country or particular region generate, they mix in the atmosphere and affect everyone, right? And so that's the sense in which it's a global externality. What you do affects everyone, right? Not only you. And so this implies that every time you have a problem like this with an externality, it involves very complicated policy solutions. First of all, it requires a policy action, right? Because individual incentives are not sufficient to address the issue, So that's, the first point, which is because it's a global externality, individual incentives are not sufficient to solve it. You don't care as sufficiently because it affects others, and people are selfish to some extent, and they don't care that much about things that affect others, or at least they don't care as much as what affects them, right? So this is issue number one, and so you need to address it with policy. And in this case, because it's a global externality, you would need a global policy. So that's that. And so the question is, how can we generate a global policy when, like you said, the decision makers, the countries that actually establish these policies are individual countries. They are not. There's no global body that has authority on all the nations in the world. And so the only way the world has to make the decisions like this is to try to form some sort of agreement or collective action that they can that is self-enforced, that namely that individual countries are willing to take because they think that it is going to help them ultimately by solving this problem. And like trade agreements, for example, in the WTO is a good example of like a global agreement. It's not completely global, but I mean, there's many countries that are involved in the WTO and that realize that, well, even though we individually may have incentives to put tariffs on others, right? If none of us puts tariffs on the others, it's probably a better outcome for the world than, the individual optimal tariff. And so getting together and agreeing to have like a global solution it's a better outcome. And so if we can kind of enforce it and punish whoever kind of deviates from the agreement and that type of thing, then we can probably get to a better outcome. And so there's some circumstances in which this has happened. Now, in the particular case of CO2 emissions, right? Even though there's some willingness to get together and think about global policies, etc., like the Paris Agreement, the problem is that these commitments have been so far very weak. And so what we have done is to try to kind of think about exactly what are the commitments that were made, bring them to a model like the ones we've been talking about, and think, well, what's going to be the impact of this type of policy if we were to implement it, forgetting about whether it's whether countries actually going to do it and follow through with it. Suppose that we take it and we say everyone is going to follow through with it, etc. We forget about the politics of the issue and we just said let's suppose everyone does what they said they would. What would be the impact? And the answer is that the impact is very small. The commitments are just not ambitious enough if the goal is the stated goal of the agreement, which is to keep, temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. And so if that, above industrial, pre-industrial levels. So if that's the goal, then this is not enough. And it's not enough by a wide margin. So you need to be much more aggressive than this if you want to achieve that goal. Now, then we can ask, is that the right goal? Should we try to achieve that goal? I mean, that's a question that we should definitely ask as well. But if conditional on that being the goal, this is clearly not enough, and we need something that is 10 times more ambitious than this, right?
So a bit like a Band-Aid in some sense. So you have a table here that shows up, you have unilateral carbon taxes to achieve the Paris Agreement pledges and consequences. So you have Asia Pacific here at $6.71 per metric ton of CO2 or ton of CO2, right?
Yep.
$6-7. So and they are very, very different. Sub-Saharan Africa is $61. North America is $11 approximately. And then you have a computation here that is sort of a percentage real GDP effect of these policies, and they're quite different as well. So this goes back to the incentives. So we, come back and talk about in Paris how we're going to accomplish this. but leaders change, political parties change in all these countries, and
Right.
they may have their own agendas. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I mean, I think what this tells you is it puts into question the ability to tackle this issue through carbon taxes on their own, right? I mean, because the pledges have been so minimal, so and like you pointed out from that table, the actual implications of those pledges so far are. Would require taxes that are, pretty small on top of, so meaning, this is not, you can achieve the Paris Agreement pledge. It's not going to do that much, but it's also not very so costly for you to do it because the implied carbon taxes are relatively small. Right, so that's what you see in that table. So the 6.71 of Asia Pacific, that's telling you is that the pledges that Asia the Pacific or an average countries in Asia Pacific made in the Paris Agreement are equivalent to them imposing a tax of $6.71 per ton of CO2. And if they were to do that, then they would achieve their pledge in the Paris Agreement. So, but that's kind of pretty low. If you go to the rest of the results, what they show is that, well, if you actually want to achieve, the goal of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by, say, 2050, which is not, that far, that would imply about $25 per ton of CO2. And if you want to achieve that by 2100, because temperatures are increasing, right? So if preventing temperatures to increase by more than 2 degrees Celsius by 2100 is even harder, right? Because the overall temperatures are increasing. So that would require taxes, I mean, just to give you an idea, of about $400 or more than that. So that's already, of course, like, an order of magnitude higher, or 2 orders of magnitude higher than the pledges that they made originally. And so the question is, do we think that this is even feasible, that this would ever happen, right? Now, of course, this is all, one important caveat on all of this is that this is all taking the technology and the ability to substitute between different types of energy as given, right? If at some point we get like a great technology that allows us to produce green energy much cheaper, then of course, that could make the transition simpler and less costly. So there's an issue of, well, innovation, of course, can help a lot, right?
So in other words, Esteban, if I understand this, in other words, yeah, the Paris numbers are sort of a very cosmetic band-aid. To make things happen, it has to be an order of magnitude higher than what is there. And so the real solution then sort of points to, as you say, the technology. So there are some noise around fusion, as you know, nowadays. If you get fusion at large scale, we get nearly zero cost energy. If you get to nearly zero cost energy, this problem basically goes away.
Right.
So at least at the intuitive level, it feels like that is really the only way out for us, rather than a tax.
I mean, the question is how are we gonna get there? I mean, how is this technology innovation gonna happen, and what type of incentives do we need to put in place in order for that type of innovation to be incentivized and happen, earlier than it would otherwise happen? And part of the goal of these carbon taxes is, in some sense, to also give incentives for that technological evolution. So if you price carbon and the price of carbon is high, etc., then of course doing this type of innovations becomes more profitable, and which incentivize their creation, etc. So there's a lot of work that has been done in economics. It's not work that I've done that much in particular, but in general, about incentive, pricing carbon also not only so that individuals substitute away from carbon fuels and from energy use in general, but also to incentivize innovation in green technologies or other forms of energy generation that can help solve this problem and can also make the optimal taxes required to achieve this type of goals smaller, right? But right now, so what this is telling you is like, if we think that the solution is just put some carbon price or carbon tax that is high enough, well, that has to be really high if the goal is to achieve, this kind of benchmark temperature increase or below that, right? So that's the issue. Now, there's another aspect of this, which is, when you impose carbon taxes, one of the things that you're doing is like people, in firms, etc., are going to use less carbon-based energy, and so they're going to substitute away from it. And so what that implies is that there's a lot of oil and gas, etc., out there that is going to be used less, right? So in the future, that has like this kind of a negative impact in the sense that it's, because you didn't use it, it's going to be cheaper in the future. And so the incentives to use it in the future are going to be higher. So that kind of goes against you all the time. So you impose a tax, people don't use these forms of energy. That makes them cheaper, right? Which in turn kind of undoes the tax to some extent. And so this type of mechanism can essentially what it implies is that when you impose one of these taxes, it delays use, but it doesn't really eliminate use because ultimately those carbon fuels are there, and if you don't use them, they become cheap enough that at some point there's for some uses or some countries or some industries are going to end up using them, and so you're delaying mostly the use of carbon. Now, delaying is useful if there's the new technologies like the ones that you were describing, etc., are gonna come. So if they are forthcoming, then of course delaying is great because we don't put all those emissions into the atmosphere, and the technology eventually happens, and then that's kind of a good outcome, right?
Now, it's like the pandemic.
Exactly.
If you delay it and you get a vaccine, we can take care of it. Right?
Exactly. So it's like you want to flatten the temperature curve, because if you flatten the temperature curve and a solution is forthcoming, like a vaccine in that analogy, then it's very useful, right? But if it's not, if the vaccine never comes, then staying at home is useless, right? Because eventually you have to come out, and then we're all going to get sick because we don't have immunity, right? So that's exactly that analogy.
Yeah, but as you say, Esteban, could be a free rider problem here too in the tactical sense. So if we move away from carbon, and carbon gets very inexpensive, some countries may have the temptation to use it exclusively. As we have seen in this recent war, lot of oil embargo that happened on Russia, there are few countries taking advantage of it. They're getting paid a lot of money for oil.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a very important thing, right? That at the end of the day, there's a resource there that is useful to produce energy, right? It has all these negative externalities for the world, but you want to be very careful not to essentially just lower the price of that input by putting restrictions for its use in certain economies, etc. Because at the end of the day, developing economies that maybe care less or are in situations where, they just have a different agenda given their level of development, where, it's more important to give, to allow some of your population to develop economically than to help with the climate problem, are going to take advantage of it, and they're going to use it. And so those incentives, you're just increasing those incentives. And so that's always there, and it's always a problem for this policy. And so that's part of what we want to kind of try to understand with these type of models, exactly these type of mechanisms by which, you do the policy. It seems all, well designed, but at the end of the day, you have all these non-intended consequences where you are not really solving the issue, but you are distorting the economy today quite a bit in the sense that there's some heavy losses. I mean, the other interesting thing about this is that because this type of policy involves costs today and potential benefits in the future, when climate is going to be less warm and there's going to be some benefits as a result of having emitted less in the past, but it's like current losses, future gains, right? And when we say future gains, it's potentially we're talking like a century, right, or a century and a half, or 2 centuries, right? So it's really, future is not the medium term, is the really long term. And so in that sense, it's one of we very seldom face policy that has such a clear and large intertemporal dimension, right? Where we need to ask people today to sacrifice in terms of their well-being in order to help future generations that are not necessarily your kids, but are your great grandkids, right? So and the question is, are people willing to do that, and how willing are they, right? How far can we push this if we really want to get to this type of targets like the ones in the Paris Agreement? And so if we're not willing to impose this type of very high carbon taxes, etc., then we have to ask the question, well, then we are going to have to adapt. Then this is going to happen. It's going to happen, we're not going to be able to prevent it unless, we are kind of lucky and some big technological innovation kind of saves us relatively soon from this. Otherwise, we're going to have to face these larger temperatures, and the world is going to have to adapt to it, right? And so thinking about how that adaptation is going to happen, and thinking about how can we reduce the costs of this adaptation is essential as well. So it's not only about eliminating the problem. Eliminating the problem is something obviously we should think about, etc. That's the discussion we were just having. But there's another important question, which is, if it's going to happen, how are we going to adapt to it? And how can we have a world economy that is better at adapting? And it involves adapting with smaller costs. And the key to that is that we need to allow for flows across locations, and in some sense we need to allow for a globalized world, because a globalized world helps a lot in that adaptation. A world where people can move across countries, a world where people can trade across countries, a world in which investment flows can happen from one region to the other. It's a world in which this adaptation is much less costly, and that new distribution of economic activity can take hold and can be we can reach that in a pretty efficient way. And so to me, the idea of globalization and these flows that I just talked about is very much linked to the ability of the world to adapt to this and other phenomena as well, but certainly to the phenomenon of climate change.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm thinking about this the right way, Esteban. So when there's a lot of future uncertainty, what humanity is holding is sort of an option. And it's never optimum to exercise an option early. And so when there is a lot of uncertainty, I would imagine we will continue delaying exercising an option to stop climate change. And this uncertainty is coming from a lot of different directions. As you say, there are a lot of paths to tackling this. That's an uncertainty: migration, adaptation, and so on. but there is a huge technological discontinuity uncertainty that if you get free cost, free energy, the game is over,
Yeah.
right? That there's really no need to worry. And so, from a policy direction here, do you think we can get anywhere? It seems optimum to keep delaying the decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand. I mean, I think the key issue is that there's a lot of discussion about this that is very, in my view, is not very helpful because it's very categorical, right? I mean, in the sense, it's not about, okay, let's evaluate this. Let's see how costly it is. Let's compare with other with other problems that we have and different types of policy solutions and how costly these policy solutions are, etc. Let's think about how we can optimize given all of that, which is obviously what ultimately countries are doing inevitably, perhaps through their political process, through the interest of particular groups and pressure groups, etc. Uh, and a community that wants to think about this as, this is the worst thing that has happened to the world, and we have to just throw everything that we got at it, right? Because it's an existential issue for humanity. And the problem is that once you make it an existential issue for humanity, then of course nothing competes, right? Nothing competes, and so there's this view that we have to just do everything it takes to solve this problem. But of course, countries that, I mean, you were talking about India. I grew up and was born in Mexico. These are countries in which there's lots of problems, right? There's lots of very severe problems that you want to solve, and so that the priority list is very long and very extreme for many different issues. And so at the end of the day, the question is, when you go to these countries and you say, well, how much are you willing to actually sacrifice to try to solve this issue? The reality is that they are not willing to sacrifice as much because there's many priorities for them. And so there's that rhetoric, and there's something, but at the end of ultimately, the policy action is pretty timid because they don't see, because they see this whole list of priorities, and this is not priority number one even for them. And so in some sense, this view of putting it as a categorical issue where it's all or nothing, to me has not been very helpful in providing or in pushing countries to find solutions. So I think the first thing is to say, well, we need to really kind of embrace evaluation, as we do with every sort of other problem and other policy that is out there. We need to evaluate the problem, we need to evaluate the potential solutions, and we need to think about what that involves. And so this is kind of the type of effort that I'm doing, but I mean that many others are in economics and other fields are doing as well. But that there's a community that doesn't really want to engage in it, wants to think about this as a problem that shouldn't be about trade-offs. It should be about, put everything that we can on it. And so we need to embrace evaluation. And only then can you get to realistic policy solutions and realistic commitments where countries are going to do what they can and what they're really willing to do given their policy priorities. And I think that's at the ultimately where the only thing that we can expect from these countries. Now, if there's a group of other countries that is like the Amazon is a good example, right? If there's a bunch of countries that are willing to spend more on preventing this from happening because they've solved many of their other problems already, right? Like development, I mean, or the well-being or some basic subsistence for their populations, etc. And they're willing to put more resources on this problem. Well, they should be willing to go and say, well, Brazil, you're a poor country. I understand that part of your population wants to use the resources in the Amazon to earn a living, but this is very costly for the world, and so we're going to have to, we want to intervene and we want to help out in order for this not to happen, so that this externality for the world is not realized. And I think that's the way to go then, of course. But we need to recognize the reality of the policy of this. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere in terms of global agreements on it.
Yeah. So fundamentally, Esteban, we got 200 countries, and when there is a global externality, and we had a good taste of pandemic more recently, which is a short-term thing, this is a long-term thing that we're talking about. When the 200 countries with differential, as you analyze in the paper, differential welfare effects, both positive and negative, it seems to me that it's nearly impossible to get consensus. And as you said, locally, they have different prioritizations. They have all sorts of different problems, and this may not be the top thing for them to solve. So are we sort of spinning our wheels here in terms of getting these countries together and getting consensus and put some numbers on it? Seems like a feel-good exercise.
I mean, like I was saying with the trade analogy, I mean, the WTO, etc. There are some global issues where the world has come together and has been successful in implementing some policy. Nothing. I mean, this is very big in scale. So that's one issue that obviously complicates this. That the actual policy solutions would require, big and aggressive policies that would change the economies of some of these countries in significant ways. And so, of course, achieving agreement in those cases is much harder. But there are, at least at a smaller scale, there are examples of agreements that have been successful to address global externalities or coordination issues across countries. And so I think the point is to be realistic, perhaps think about more of the incentives that carbon taxes are going to create for innovation, not really think that this is all going to be solved with huge carbon taxes, but be perhaps less ambitious and start by imposing carbon, some sort of carbon pricing everywhere, even if it's not as large, but that serves as a kind of basis for an agreement that then we can kind of progressively push forward. I mean, the other thing is, it has to be that at least if the richest countries in the world that are also relatively highly affected by some of this, that, in principle, when you can look at, for example, this local social cost of carbon, which is one of the things that we calculate in those papers, which tells you what is the price of carbon that would solve the problem or the gap between the social value and the private value in a particular region. What you see is that some of, for example, the south of the United States, say Florida, to take up a concrete example, would be willing or should be willing, according to this calculation, to have a very high world price of carbon. Now, the question is, when we go to Florida, is that the case? I mean, is Florida imposing something like that? And the answer is not really, right? So they are not. I mean, you see it in California, you see it in certain parts of the U.S., but there's many areas where, in principle, high carbon prices should benefit them, where that are still not doing so. If they are not willing to do it, then of course the world is not going to be willing to do it either. And so there's something about, well, are the countries that are the richest countries in the world, where the social cost of carbon, that the local social cost of carbon for them is relatively high, are they willing to do policy or carbon policy unilaterally and put high carbon prices unilaterally? And when that happens, and when the world sees that, perhaps that's the first step into convincing others that this is a good thing to do, etc. So a little bit like with globalization, this happened a lot, right? I mean, the rich world started trading, lower tariffs with respect to lots of other countries, and that kind of motivated countries to come in and lower their tariffs as a way of incorporating themselves into the globalized world. That was kind of the progression that we saw in that case as well.
So one angle you pursue in the paper, I'm going to finish up with this, is adaptation. And I haven't seen too much writing on this, Esteban, so I find this quite interesting. So, okay, so things are going to happen, let's say. We don't really take care of the problem. So we have three different angles here. Migration is one of them, trade, and innovation. Innovation more locally for adaptation. So So what do you think these things, suppose we don't really get consensus, we sort of get to 2050, we are up to 2 degrees centigrade rise. We know the implications of that all around the world already. Um, how do these things help in that context?
Right. So the key is this issue that uh, climate change is gonna, or global warming is gonna affect different parts of the world, differently. And in particular, it's gonna benefit some and hurt others. And so the key is, how do we facilitate like economic activity going from the places that are affected to the places, or negatively affected to the places that are positively affected. And so, of course, like one key aspect of that is to allow people to move, right? So if people can move to, parts of Canada, can move to parts of
Siberia.
Northern Europe, Siberia, etc. I mean, of course, then, and can develop cities there, and can, have thriving communities in that part of the world that today is essentially empty for all practical purposes. There's obviously something there, but I mean, is very, very sparsely populated. Then that progression is going to help reduce the cost of this phenomenon. So the question is, how does that happen? And I realize that for people to think about, Alaska or northern Canada or Siberia, etc., being populated and having like thriving cities, etc., is kind of hard to imagine. But of course, look backwards, right? Look back in history and think about the economy in, in 1750. Right? That was a very different economy, and the geography of the world was a very different geography, right, than the one today. China and the United States and all of America. I mean, the world was quite different, was much more Eurocentric, etc. So, thinking about moving forward the next 150 years, etc., of course, those places can develop, right? And the world can simply, shift more activity into those places. And to the extent that that happens, that's, like I said, it's going to reduce the cost of all of this. And so the question is, how costly is that process, that adjustment process of the economy? And like I was saying, if we can, one important aspect to all of this is not only to think about carbon taxes and whether we can impose carbon taxes, which is of course important too, but it's also about, can we allow and can we reduce the cost of that type of adaptation? Can we stand in the way of countries closing their borders, of pushback against trade flows and capital flows, etc.? Because those are the ones that are going to allow this adjustment to happen. Now, of course, one important aspect of all of this is the nation state, right? So the institution of the nation state is it prevents to some extent that adaptation to happen, because you live in a country and that country has some institutions, and it establishes nationality that makes creates restrictions in terms of the flow of people, etc. And so part of it is, can we avoid that those barriers and those borders to become more of a hindrance to this type of adaptation? And I think one of the big dangers here is that when we see part of the migration that is going to result from this process, as Central America gets warmer and India gets warmer and Central Africa gets warmer, and those people start flowing north, Can we prevent some of the countries in the northern latitudes to stop and prevent migration and impose more stringent immigration policies and things like that? And if to the extent that that were to happen, that can increase the cost of climate change significantly. So I think that's a key issue, that we want to keep those borders porous, and we want to allow for that migration to happen. Now, ultimately, that migration is going to help. If Canada is going to develop the northern part of its territory, it's going to need a ton of people, right? It's going to need a ton of investment. So it's in their self-interest to do this, right? I mean, it's not. But of course, we know that the immigration debate, etc., is not always easy because it comes with a lot of cultural issues and nationality issues, etc., that can be tricky to navigate politically. So
one positive thing that might be happening, Esteban, is that the initial projections were that the world population is going to peak at 10 billion in 2100. The more recent projections are that it might peak at 9 billion by 2050 or 2060 and very rapidly decline from there.
Right.
And so we might be heading to a regime that is quite contrary to expectations that human resources are the most valuable thing on Earth. And so all this immigration policies that countries conduct today tactically could be quite stupid, just looking 30, 40 years into the future.
I couldn't agree more. And in fact, we're already seeing it to some extent, right? I mean, I think Canada and other countries, they're feeling that they need people, and so they're trying to attract people. Now, there's still this issue of, well, I want to attract skilled people and not other types, etc. But of course, ultimately, all of this is irrelevant in the sense that, whether you attract today skilled people or unskilled people, it doesn't matter. Next generation, you're going to educate the next generation anyway, right? I mean, so once we take kind of a time dimension that is a little bit broader than the next couple of decades, then of course we're talking about future generations, and future generations are all going to be educated locally. And so to the extent that you can have a good education system, etc., you can prevent what the particular skill level of individuals that you attract is not that essential for your development. So I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think these policies are self-defeating and are going to be more so in the future. But of course, like I said, I mean, there are these issues about cultural integration, etc., that people care about, and that in general have been very salient in determining immigration policy, as we've seen everywhere in the world, and we've seen kind of a backlash against a lot of this from groups that feel that they've been hurt by it, even though whether they have been hurt or not is not clear at all. And in general, my view is that immigration has been very positive for most countries.
That you talk about is trade here, and I was thinking, Esteban, that one could envision autonomous production facilities. So maybe driven by solar and artificial intelligence and other things, we may have autonomous production centers in areas where humans don't want to live, but the humans are going to live elsewhere. And so trade could become a very important thing here, right? In terms of managing this process.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, we have that, plus we have this whole phenomenon that we're kind of getting a little bit of a taste for now, which is the work from home phenomenon, where people are going to be, working, but they can work from wherever they want. And essentially, because it's intellectual work, you can communicate it online, etc. And so where people are going to be physically and where they will be spending their income, etc., is not necessarily where that production is happening, or where the firms with that employ them are physically located. So it's not even clear that that's going to be a concept where the firm is physically located anymore. I mean, it may be something that is just a globalized entity that has no real location, physical location. So I agree with that. But ultimately, people are physical and they're going to be living somewhere. and wherever that happens, you are going to need to have a flow of goods into those places. So we want to facilitate that process. I think that's really essential. This idea that is normally not put together when in the discussion about climate change, the idea that a globalized world is more effective in dealing with climate change and with the consequences of climate change. And yeah.
No, no. So let me ask you sort of the concluding question. So we have a lot of data now. People were not that sure things were going in the wrong direction in the 1990s. And I don't know how many of those people are left, but the data is quite clear. Things are moving in one direction and one direction only. We have seen sort of patchy attempts like Paris agreements and so on, but there are a lot of incentives for people to free ride and all sorts of bad things going on there. So if you were to think about policies now, what would be 1, 2, 3 things that you'll focus on? I feel like it's almost guaranteed we are not going to solve the problem completely, even if you make some minor, improvements to the problem. So what would be a few policy things that you will pursue today, starting today?
So I would do 3 things. I would, first of all, think about creating much more conscious about this issue of adaptation and the fact that if you want to combating climate change is very much in line with allowing migration to flow, allowing trade to flow, etc., and capital to flow. And that those things are linked together. And if you care about the environment, you should care about this adaptation process. If you care about the negative consequences that this should have, and so linking trade, migration, and investment policy to the climate change issue is very important. That's the issue number 1, and should be discussed together. And the second, like perhaps the policy package more specifically that I think is probably a good policy package is, yes, a carbon tax, try to, continue this process of trying to agree on some kind of baseline tax, even if it's not as ambitious as what it would be needed in order to solve the 2 degrees Celsius, but mostly to generate the incentives so that some form of abatement technology eventually is forthcoming. And so to generate those incentives, and you can of course incentivize that directly too, and that's mostly for the developed world, for Europe, for the United States, and perhaps other places that have good innovation centers where maybe give direct incentives to develop some of those technologies. I am more generally a little bit more skeptical about direct incentives just because I think it's so hard to pick winners and losers in the technology game. But to the extent that countries are willing to go on their own in terms of carbon policy, even if there is no agreement, I think the goal at the end of the day of that, more than substitution of use, is really creating the incentives for the innovation centers in those countries to concentrate on these problems of reducing carbon emissions.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Esteban. It's a really important problem, very complex one. So hopefully a lot of people are working on it. And what is exciting about it is that technologists have a role to play here, economists have a role to play here, policymakers, almost everybody can play a role here to improve the situation. So that makes it interesting.
Interesting and challenging because we have to communicate with each other, and many times it's complicated to do. And so that's part of the challenge, is to coordinate all these different points of view of what's important, what's not, and how to think about those trade-offs.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks again for spending time with me.
Thank you, Jill. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.